You unlock this benefit with the key of Patreon. Beyond is another dimension. A dimension of thought. A dimension of speculation. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both waffle and substance. Of things and ideas. You've just crossed into the podcast zone.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a Stories Out of Time and Space bonus episode. That's right, Julian and I are jumping straight in, and we're going to keep these short and concise because we are going to be looking at the Twilight Zone. Every episode, these are going to be some bonus just for you. And if you're on Patreon, you're getting these exclusive early bird before they go out to the general public, which could be months from now, so you're getting a real exclusive. And we're not going to mess around because we're going to keep these really short, which is why I'm trying to talk as fast as possible. So between me and Julian, we're probably going to be keeping this to 15 minutes an episode. And we're going to go from the beginning, and we're going to go through every episode, and we may be joined by other guests along the way. We will find out. But other than that, we're going to jump right in with Where Is Everybody? The first episode of The Twilight Zone by Rod Serling. So, Julian, I'm going to go straight to you, mate. So, where is everybody? First thoughts.
I think it is a weaker episode. I think that it is basically like today, it would be a VR style story, right?
Yes.
But so basically, like, you know, the entire thing is like he's stranded alone in a town. You know, he has adventures. It's a kind of like thought experiment, which I think some of the best Twilight Zone episodes are. And in the end, you know, it's part of preparations for space flight and dealing with loneliness. So I dig the kind of original context of sort of, you know, what's going to happen in space, you know, how are we going to deal with this? But it's basically an extended fantasy that winds up being a VR.
Yeah, it's weird that it's an opener. I mean, this goes to show how TV is different, because this would be a mid-season, let's save some budgetary money kind of episode, I think, nowadays. Weird fact, the whole sort of bit where he's trapped takes place in Hill Valley. This is the set that was used for Gremlins in Hill Valley. I spotted it when I saw the courthouse. I was like, "Ooh, I know that." I do like the fact, though, that this thing is obviously about sensory deprivation. Like this theme of loneliness seems to be one Rod Serling will come back to, even with even with the first sort of batch few episodes. But I like the fact that this whole fantasy, like as it's set up, like this is a separate reality, and I can't dig this idea of like, when you're lonely like this, your sanity starts to slip to the extent of like he visualizes weirdly like this picturesque American town, but no people. And you know, and I don't think he's trying to say anything, but it's a really odd. I don't know. It's like, you know, he doesn't recognize anything. Like we have an episode coming up where a guy goes back to his hometown. It's like, you know, if you're going to be in that sort of isolation, would you not, sensory deprivation? Would you not picture things you'd recognize? You know, like you say, your hometown, your childhood house. I don't know. It's sort of
yeah, it doesn't really make sense. And there's the attempt to sort of connect it with his environment. When we cut to him in the sensory deprivation tank, he smashed the clock, and that is presumably supposed to be him smashing into a mirror, you know, which you see shatter. And so there are these kind of like little sort of wannabe Alice in Wonderland sort of corollaries, but they don't really work. Like, as you say, you know, if you're stuck in the sensory deprivation tank, why would you imagine this town you don't know and this mirror? And it's like the premise is just an excuse to play with this thought experiment, right?
Yeah.
It's just, well, you know, you go crazy, you could hallucinate anything. So,
yeah.
So, you know, I mean, that's fine for what it is. I mean, I will say that at its best, it is sort of does have some of that Twilight Zone creepiness with the empty town. And if you've ever, you know, been, I mean, like, you know, we've gone through COVID, right? There are times where, you know, you're in, it's not quite, well, you know, sort of we addressed in the third season, Vanilla Sky. You know, it's not kind of like Times Square empty kind of creepiness, right? But it has some of that. I would say that at its best, it has sort of a kind of like Philip K. Dick feeling of like that paranoia of I'm being watched, but I don't know by who, you know, and finding the paperback like The Last Man on Earth, where it's like, this is creepy. And I don't think it really works, but it does kind of prefigure that.
I like what it's going for though in that sense, because I say that creepiness of the town, because it's a picturesque town as well. Like, you know, they've chosen it for it to be a very picturesque, very sort of like middle America kind of town. But it's they set things up as well that, like, it's not that this has been abandoned for, you know, a long period of time. Like, everything's spotless. You know, you have the van there with the mannequin in, and then when he goes into the cinema, like that's the bit I find creepy. Like, he goes into the cinema and then the projector comes on.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Who's there?" Like, there's constantly moments when you're like, "Oh, there's got to be some acting party in this," you know, to have put the mannequin in the van, or you know, to activate the cinema screen. Like, there's got to be some active parties, and there's just not.
Or the telephone that rings, right?
Yes.
Somebody's got to have called that number, right?
Well, again, like, you know, you say about the Alice in Wonderland idea, this thing of connecting it to the real world. It seems like, again, a missed opportunity. I know I do this thing, but like you say, he breaks the mirror that then is reflected in the clock. It's like, okay, well, you know, it would have been really cool if when you come back you find that there's a buzzer in the cell thing that he's in. Like, you know, where's this light coming from that he then thinks is the projector, and sort of like, has that little, you know, pod, what's in there that's sort of creeping into his fantasy? Like, where's that break between reality and you know, fantasy? It never quite.
There's also the sort of like emergency call button that is supposed to be the sort of triggering of the street lights. You know, like the sort of call to change the lights. But, you know, this is the kind of thing that, like, in the script would read like, "Oh shit, that's cool," right?
Yeah.
But in practice, sort of feels like, yeah, those are two little gestures toward that. And where did everything else come from? And you're quite right. Like, a little bit of light could have been nice to, you know, reflect that movie. I do like that movie bit. I do like the that he sort of realizes he's in the Air Force, but he doesn't know what the Air Force is. Like, you know, I don't know why he's suffering from amnesia, you know, except he went crazy and anything's happened.
It's that generic craziness, though, isn't it? Because you find out that he's been in there for something along those lines. Like, I think it says like 420 hours.
484.
484. They go 484
cool.
hours. Yeah, and that's, you know, it's a long time. And, you know, again, but there's nothing there about sleep deprivation or sensory deprivation. And I get it about this idea of loneliness and this idea of solitude and confinement. But it's sort of, it never quite links up to say, like, okay, well, this is, and I know that that's the point of the Twilight Zone, is not to give you all the answers, but they just come out and go like, oh yeah, he just went a bit crazy for a moment, but then, like, as soon as he comes, it's just a flip at the end. He comes out and they're carrying him away on a stretcher, and he's like, I can't go back there. I'm never going to go back there. And his general whatever's like, it's all right, son. We know what you're doing. This was to send you to the moon. And you're like, oh, that's the reveal. And then within minutes, he's like pointing at the moon and going, I'll see you soon. And I'm like, hang on a minute. What happened to you feeling terrified of solitude a minute ago? Like, you know.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, he sort of like reverses himself and he's like, well, sorry, I kind of cracked up at the end there. I do like that the military is compassionate toward him. But, you know, I think that, you know, also, I mean, this is 1959, right? I mean, there isn't even a space race, really. You know, we're talking Sputnik era. And, you know, really, I mean, this is the era in which, like, the Fantastic Four, maybe there are cosmic rays up there. It's just going to make us mutate. Who knows, right? So, but I do think there's a kind of, like, Rod Serling has a kind of spirituality. And there's this discussion, you know, that's very quiet. It's a very sort of like liberal, if it is, it might be vaguely deist. It's not really atheistic, but it's not really Christian or, you know, organized religion either. It's sort of like a vaguely deistic, you know, sort of like, there is a sort of like loving God kind of stuff. That goes beyond deism, but there is a spirituality there that comes through in Serling, and I think some of these episodes, the best episodes, have this, where there's a kind of compassion for humanity, and there's this bit about how, like, we have figured out how to feed the stomach, and we figured out how to, do everything with space flight. We can run these formulas, but what about the human spirit? What about our sense of loneliness? And I think that also speaks to the post-war condition in which America has great affluence. Today, everybody has cell phones, everybody has, video on demand. We have things that, our ancestors, like working in the fields and, gathering for sustenance, couldn't imagine. And yet we're also screwed up, and we're going to psychiatrists and having anger outbursts. And it's like, we live in utopia.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they do that, because again, like you say about, this idea of sort of the endurance, I suppose, this idea of like, post-war is sort of like, we need, the space race, I think, was obviously starting and that sort of thing. It's got to be the best. And this idea of sort of like, well, what is it we're aiming for now? But you're right about the fact that not only are is the military compassionate towards him, they defend him against the press.
Mm-hmm.
So the press come in and they're like, well, General, that bit where he cracked up at the end. And the guy's like, he's been in there for 484 hours. I'd like to see any of you do that, because that's a trip to the moon, some orbits of the moon, and a trip back. If anything, that's really impressive. Shut your face. And, I was really impressed that the military are like, and then he does, like you say, he's compassionate. So it's not pro-military in any way that I sort of see, but there's definitely this sort of, like you say, this perseverance of the human spirit of saying, actually, no, this is an achievement. We've done something here. Well done. It's not, he's not being denigrated. He's not being ripped down for having failed. So they're like, no, no one else could have done what you've done. Well done. And I find that's quite an interesting thing that, again, will come through from Serling, I think, throughout this, is within the Twilight Zone, it often sort of tries to push for the betterment of people. And this is the first episode. It's more obvious in other episodes, but again, there's this thing of like, no, you are doing well. Even more so, like you say, the prettiness of this small town. Like, he could have gone to like a horrible dive, but no, it's
or
even
some
in his
post-apocalyptic landscape, right?
Yeah,
you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, but even in his fantasy, like he recognizes it's the American dream. This is the sort of this sweet town with the square and all this other stuff. So there's definitely, I agree, that sort of spiritualism, that sort of, I think the positivity to this, that of science fiction positivity, that I actually found quite endearing, really, sort of for this first episode.
Yeah, and I guess I'm hard on it, and I will say that if you're going to do a fantasy, like I'm a big fan of the movie Altered States, which maybe we'll get to eventually, and the concept of sleep deprivation and the concept that our brains are not logical, right?
Yeah.
You take the most rational person in the world, deprive them of sleep and, put them in a black void, you begin hallucinating stuff. This is just something our brains are designed to do, probably to keep us from going crazy and shutting down. So you don't really see that experience, right? You don't see inside that tank as dark, right? You just see it lit up as, it's revealed. But I do like, hey, at least the idea of like a vacant world reflects his experience of loneliness. So, yes, you can kind of do whatever you want with that fantasy. The excuse is kind of, lame in a way, but as an exploration of being all alone, stuck in a spacecraft, it's a cool idea.
I agree with that. It's a cool idea. I mean, the one thing is the final note for me is I like this idea of this sense of reality, this idea of sort of like, this division between, going back to this idea of division between fantasy and reality, and how easy it is to fall into this fantasy. And, yes, it's this weird world when there's nobody there, but it's so perfect and so sort of together. That it does, you can question like your dream reality. Like, what's the difference between the physical, the tangible reality and this reality is experiencing? Because, or does it have consequences? Does it, how does it pan out? If it had been there longer, that sort of thing. So I do like sort of where this is heading. As an opener, like you say, it's not the most, it's not a showstopper, but again, this came out in 1959, so these different sort of standards. But I definitely enjoyed this one as an opener, as a teaser for what's to come.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts then before we sort of we wrap up on that first episode?
Well, as far as being lenient, we got to keep in mind Rod Serling was pumping these scripts out.
Yeah.
He was writing 30, 40 episodes a year, which is amazing. And the quality is astounding given that. And I think this does set the sort of tone for the series in that so many episodes are sort of like a thought experiment. They, you can summarize them in 1, 2, 3 sentences at most. And it's all about sort of like exploring the implications. And I really dig that. Some people might think it's a little slow, but I really dig that. So, any final thought?
No, I agree. I like it as that sort of that thought experiment. The other thing I kind of like is the fact the main character of this, like I don't know who he is. I don't know if he went on to do anything else, but this is a one-man show for the most part, and I think the actor that does it is actually pretty good, and holds his own in a competent way for if you were to be told, right, you're going to be on your own on screen for half an hour, and you're the opening of this TV show. That's a lot to carry. So he does a good job. So yeah, and you're right about that. I like the fact as well. Just a final thing, you say about the episode being summed up in a couple of sentences. I love these Rod Serling openings. They're so I know them as cliches. I know them as where they've all been ripped off and parodied. To hear the originals is fantastic. So really enjoying that. Anyway, there we go. That's our first episode. We've talked about Where Is Everybody, the opening episode of season 1 of the Twilight Zone, 1959. So, Julian, thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Upward and onward.
Yeah, on to the next episode. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening, and we shall see you on the next episode.